Are you ready to dive into the fascinating and often surprising history of sexuality?
I'm ready.
Perfect. We're going to be exploring how people viewed sex and sexuality from ancient Greece to the sexual revolution of the 20th century.
That's quite the span of time.
It is, and we're going to be using the book Histories of Sexuality as our guide.
Oh, great choice.
Yeah, I think it'll give us a really good foundation for this deep dive.
I agree.
Now, before we get started, I just want to say that this journey is full of surprises. Trust me.
Oh, I bet it is.
I mean, you probably assume ideas like heterosexuality and homosexuality have, always been around.
Right, like they're just universal concepts.
But those concepts are actually relatively recent inventions.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I guess it makes sense, though, when you think about it.
Yeah, it's easy to just accept the categories we use today without really questioning where they came from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just shows you how much social and cultural forces shape our understanding of who we are.
Exactly. So let's start way back in ancient Greece and Rome.
Okay.
The book describes a sexual culture that's vastly different from what we're used to.
Well, yeah, I mean, ancient Greece and Rome, things were very different back then.
Totally different.
The biggest factor wasn't about who you were attracted to, but instead it was all about your role in the sexual act.
Ah, so instead of focusing on sexual orientation, it was more about dominance and submission.
Exactly. Whether you were the active penetrating partner or the passive receiving one.
Yeah.
This active-passive dynamic, it was key to understanding social status and power.
The book mentions that male citizens had a lot of freedom when it came to choosing partners, regardless of whether they were male or female.
Yeah, that's true. For men, especially citizen men in Athens, they were allowed to have a variety of partners.
But it wasn't exactly a free-for-all,
Yeah,
right?
right. Ancient Greco-Roman society, especially in Athens, was actually very structured. Social status and strict rules governed behavior. And for men, taking the active role was absolutely essential for proving their masculinity and also their citizenship.
Right. So it's not just about who you're sleeping with, but how you're sleeping with them.
Exactly. And speaking of power dynamics, the book highlights the Roman term virago.
Virago, what does that mean?
It literally meant man-woman, and it was used to describe a sexually dominant woman.
Oh, that's a pretty loaded term.
It certainly is. It shows just how threatening a powerful woman was to the ancient Romans.
Wow, so they actually invented a word to demonize women who didn't fit into their limited roles.
Pretty much. Virago was their way of saying, this woman is stepping out of line.
It seems like this fear of female power, disrupting the established order, that's something we see again and again throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. It's a theme that pops up in different forms across cultures and time periods.
It's kind of depressing, but also really interesting to see those patterns, how they repeat.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's not just social norms, right? The book also talks about how ancient medical texts viewed female orgasm as essential for procreation.
Oh, that's right. I mean, imagine thinking that a woman had to climax in order to conceive.
It's like they didn't even understand basic biology.
Well, it shows you how their understanding of biology was filtered through the values and norms of their time.
It makes you wonder, what assumptions we're making today that future generations will find strange. Like, are we looking back at our current beliefs and practices in 100 years and be like, what were they thinking?
Oh, absolutely. There are probably so many things we take for granted that will seem completely absurd in the future.
Exactly. The book also mentions this intriguing subculture of men called the Senate.
Spontaneity, yeah.
They preferred the passive role in sexual encounters. So some historians see them as an early form of homosexual identity. But is that really accurate? I mean, it sounds a bit anachronistic, right?
That's a really good question, and it sparks a lot of debate among historians.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to impose our modern categories onto the past.
Right, and it might not be the right way to understand those experiences.
I mean, it's possible, right, that the Semites were expressing something completely different from what we understand as homosexuality today.
Exactly, and that their experiences were shaped by the specific social and cultural context of ancient Rome. David Halperin, for instance, argues that it was more about gender inversion than sexual orientation.
So the ridicule and punishment they faced might not have been solely due to their attraction to men.
Exactly. It might have been more about defying those traditional masculine norms we were just talking about.
So it seems like even trying to understand sexuality in ancient times is really complex and open to interpretation.
It definitely is. But one thing's for sure, It was vastly different from how we see things today.
That's for sure. So the book then takes us to the rise of Christianity and kind of a shift towards a more austere view of sexuality.
Right. It's a big transition in how people were thinking about sex and the body.
Would you say that was a complete break from the past?
Well, it's tempting to point to Christianity as, the sole reason for that change.
Yeah.
But it's more nuanced than that. The book points out that this shift towards austerity actually began in pagan Rome before Christianity became the dominant force.
Oh, interesting. So even before Christianity, people were already starting to rethink their ideas about sexual pleasure.
Yeah. It wasn't like Christianity came along and suddenly everything changed. There were already those trends in place.
But how did Christianity add to that transition?
Well, early Christianity had a complicated relationship with sex, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a topic that's caused a lot of debate and controversy over the centuries.
Definitely. On one hand, there was this strong emphasis on celibacy and spiritual purity.
Right, that idea of renouncing worldly pleasures to focus on the divine.
But on the other hand, procreation within marriage was, it was encouraged for those not choosing a celibate life.
Right, so sex was okay as long as it was for the purpose of having children.
Exactly. It was all about controlling desire and channeling it in very specific ways. And within that, we see some interesting contradictions, like the portrayal of women.
Right. The book mentions this paradox of women in early Christianity being both idealized as the bride of Christ and demonized as the devil's gateway. It's like they couldn't quite make up their minds.
Oh, definitely. It's a real push and pull between these two extremes.
So it seems like early Christianity had this deep ambivalence about women and their bodies.
That's a great way to put it. It's this fear and fascination all mixed together.
And that ambivalence eventually led to some power struggles within the church.
Oh, absolutely. Initially, women actually held positions of influence in the early church. They established their own monastic communities. But as the centuries went on, a male hierarchy solidified, with fathers like St. Augustine and John Chrysostom really pushing women into a subordinate role.
Wow. It's like they were trying to erase the contributions women had made to the early church.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark example of how power dynamics can shift over time, and often not for the better.
So while there were clear continuities with those pre-Christian values about austerity, Christianity definitely added its own layer to this shift.
Yeah, and this debate about the role of Christianity is still ongoing among historians.
Right, exactly. It's one of those historical debates that just keeps going and going.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great example of how history is rarely black and white. There are always multiple factors at play, and those interpretations keep evolving.
So far, we've gone from the ancient world's focus on power dynamics and sex to this emerging idea that the body itself was something to be controlled and feared.
Right? Like the body had become this source of temptation that needed to be tamed.
Now let's fast forward to medieval and Renaissance Europe.
All right.
What did sexuality look like during this period?
If I had to sum it up in a phrase, it would be fear of the body. The Christian emphasis on spiritual purity, it continued to shape perceptions of sexuality throughout the Middle Ages. Bodily pleasures were seen as these dangerous temptations.
So it sounds pretty restrictive, but the book also mentions some contrasting views presented in the literature of the time.
That's right. While theological texts preached about the dangers of lust, literature offered a more diverse perspective.
So it was more of a mixed bag than we might initially think.
Absolutely. Some works presented marriage as, a pragmatic economic institution, while others celebrated romantic love, even passion.
So it seems like people were wrestling with these ideas in a lot of different ways, not just blindly accepting the church's teachings.
Exactly. People were still thinking for themselves and finding ways to express their desires, even within those constraints.
The book also talks about something called the one-sex model of the body.
Oh, right, where women were basically seen as underdeveloped men.
Imagine living in a world where people believed there was only one type of body and women were just, imperfect versions of men.
It sounds so bizarre to us now, but this one-sex model had a huge impact on how people understood sex and gender. And sex in this model was all about the interaction of hot and cold partners.
Hot and cold, what does that even mean?
Well, it was this idea that, men were naturally hot and women were cold, and that sex was about achieving this balance between those two forces.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's hard to imagine how that would even work in practice.
And what's really striking is the example the book gives about hermaphrodites. Instead of recognizing them as something, in between, People during that time forced them to conform to either male or female gender roles.
It's a really stark example of how rigid the gender binary was.
It wasn't enough to just have a certain kind of body. You had to perform the social role expected of that gender, no matter what.
It's a reminder that these categories we take for granted are often very arbitrary and based on cultural assumptions, not biological reality.
Absolutely. So in the medieval and Renaissance periods, we see this continued focus on spiritual purity, but also glimpses of different perspectives in the literature. And the one-sex model shows just how powerful those gender norms were.
It's amazing how much those ideas shaped people's understanding of their own bodies.
Now, things get even more interesting as we move into the 18th century. The book talks about this theory by Randolph Drumbach that the 18th century marks the birth of heterosexuality as we understand it today.
Trumbach's work is really groundbreaking because it challenges the assumption that heterosexuality has always been around.
So before the 18th century, people didn't really define sexual desire by being attracted to a specific gender.
That's what Trumbach argues. He says it was during the 18th century that this concept actually emerged, replacing that long-held active-passive paradigm we talked about earlier.
That's a huge shift in how people were thinking about sexuality. I mean, we take it for granted now, but this idea of being heterosexual or homosexual is relatively new.
It really is, and it shows you how much our understanding of these concepts is shaped by historical forces.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The book talks about a counterculture of libertines who challenged those societal norms and embraced a wider range of sexual expression.
The libertines, oh, they were a fascinating bunch. They were kind of like the rebels of their time, questioning everything.
It seems like they were like way ahead of their time.
Oh, absolutely. They were challenging religious moralizing, exploring different forms of sexual pleasure, and really pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable.
You could say they were like the forerunners of later movements for sexual liberation.
Oh, for sure. They were laying the groundwork for those later challenges to traditional morality.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if they'd had more influence. Would we have had a sexual revolution centuries earlier?
Now, that's a thought-provoking question. I mean, it's impossible to know for sure, but it's fascinating to speculate.
Definitely. But didn't this emphasis on pleasure also have a dark side? How did their philosophy impact women or those with less power?
That's a great question. And it's important to acknowledge that the libertine movement, it was largely driven by and focused on the experiences of privileged men.
Right, like so many movements throughout history.
The impact on women and those with less social power was often quite different and sometimes even harmful.
It's a reminder that we always have to consider those power dynamics, no matter what era we're talking about.
Exactly. Power is always at play, shaping the ways people experience and express their sexuality.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, you can't talk about libertines without mentioning the Marquis de Sade, right?
And the Marquis de Sade, he was definitely a controversial figure.
To say the least. His writings are still shocking to some people today.
Absolutely. But his exploration of extreme sexual experiences, it really blurred the lines between pornography and literature.
His work forced people to confront the complexities of desire and the limits of societal control over sexual expression.
Right. He was asking those really uncomfortable questions about power, pleasure, and the nature of morality.
So the 18th century seems like a time of real transition with the emergence of heterosexuality as a concept and the rise of this counterculture challenging the traditional rules.
It's a century full of contradictions and complexities, that's for sure.
So what happened next? The book then takes us to the Victorian era.
Ah, the Victorian era. So often stereotyped as being, incredibly prudish and repressed.
Exactly. And that stereotype, as the book makes clear, isn't entirely accurate.
It's much more complicated than that. While Victorian society certainly had its share of moral anxieties, sexuality was actually a topic of significant debate and discussion.
So it's amazing how those stereotypes persist, even when the historical reality is much more complex.
They really do have a way of sticking around.
So if it wasn't all about repression, what was the Victorian era really like when it came to sexuality?
Well, the book highlights the rise of the bourgeois family ideal and the separation of spheres.
Right, this idea that the home was a woman's domain while men were out in the public sphere.
Exactly. The home became associated with, with female purity and domesticity. and men were expected to navigate the supposedly corrupting world of the public sphere.
So a very stark division between male and female roles.
A real separation of worlds with very different expectations for men and women.
That sounds like it would inevitably lead to a double standard.
And it absolutely did. The Victorian era idealized chaste women
Hmm.
while simultaneously tolerating male promiscuity. Prostitution flourished, seen by many as a necessary evil to satisfy men's supposedly uncontrollable urges.
You might think of the Victorian era as all, buttoned up and repressed, but behind closed doors, there was a thriving sex industry.
It's a good reminder that what happens in public and what happens in private are often two very different things.
It's almost like they had this, don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to men's desires. But the book also mentions that historians are uncovering a more nuanced picture, right?
Yes. I mean, history is always being reinterpreted. New evidence comes to light,
I don't
and
know.
we have to revise our understandings.
The idea that the Victorians were totally repressed is a gross oversimplification.
Absolutely. It's way too simplistic.
While there was a lot of moralizing going on, there's also evidence of couples using contraception and even finding pleasure in marital sex.
Exactly. They weren't all just abstaining or having joyless procreative sex. There was more going on than the stereotype suggests.
It's like in every era, there's this constant tension between societal norms and individual desires. People always find ways to express themselves, even within those constraints.
It's human nature. We're complex beings with a wide range of desires and needs, and those don't just disappear because society tells us they should.
Now, the next section of the book dives into the intersection of dominance and desire. It explores how class, race, and sexuality all played a role, especially in the context of imperialism.
This is where we see how power dynamics shape not just individual experiences, but entire systems of belief.
It's about how those larger structures of power influence how we understand and experience our own sexuality.
Exactly. And during this period, working class women were often portrayed as both sexually available and morally depraved
Oh.
in the eyes of middle class observers.
So they were both objectified and condemned at the same time. It's like they were seen as this threat to the moral order.
Right. It's this classic double bind where women are damned if they do and damned if they don't.
The book mentions a fascinating case study of a middle-class man named Arthur Munby, who eroticized working-class women.
Arthur Munby. Oh yeah, he was a bit of an odd character. His relationship with Hannah Colwick, his maid and later his wife, is a really interesting example of how power and desire are intertwined.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Munby was obsessed with Hannah's working class identity.
So it wasn't just about Hannah herself, but about what she represented.
Exactly. He was fascinated by her status, her work clothes, her way of speaking.
He was projecting all of these fantasies onto her based on her class.
It's a great example of how those societal hierarchies, those power differentials, can really distort our perceptions of others and even shape our desires.
It's a bit disturbing, actually, when you think about it. Like he was exploiting her for his own gratification.
And that's a really important point. The power dynamics in their relationship are impossible to ignore. It wasn't a relationship between equals.
So his case study reveals a lot about the anxieties surrounding class and sexuality during the Victorian era.
Definitely. It shows how class and gender intersected to create these very specific power dynamics that shaped both desire and exploitation.
But this theme of dominance and desire wasn't limited to individual relationships.
Oh, absolutely not. This played out on a global scale. The book discusses Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, which explores how the West constructed the East as exotic and sensual.
It's like we see this pattern repeating itself throughout history. One group projecting its fears and fantasies onto another, often to justify exploitation and control.
That's a very perceptive observation, and it's a pattern worth paying attention to. These power dynamics continue to shape our understanding of sexuality today.
Let's move on to the next section, which focuses on female friendships in the 19th century. The book raises this question of whether these relationships can be seen as expressions of lesbian identity.
That's a complex and hotly debated topic, isn't it?
It is. I mean, some historians like Carol Smith Rosenberg and Lillian Faderman argue that that these, passionate romantic friendships between women were indeed early forms of lesbian relationships.
And they make some really compelling arguments. They point to the intensity of the emotions, the physical intimacy, the language used to describe these relationships.
So they're challenging that traditional view that these relationships were purely platonic.
They're saying that we need to look beyond our modern assumptions about what constitutes a romantic or sexual relationship and consider the full range of human experience.
It makes sense, I guess, that in a society that was so restrictive, women might have found, emotional and physical intimacy with each other.
Absolutely. And their work has been really influential in helping us to understand the diversity of women's experiences throughout history.
But if these relationships were so common, why were they later pathologized? The book talks about how the rise of sexology in the late 19th century led to these friendships being labeled as sexual inversion.
That's right. As medicine gained more cultural authority, it started to impose its own categories and judgments on human behavior.
Hmm.
And those close friendships between women, they started to be seen as a form of mental illness.
It's a reminder that even our definitions of normal and deviant are constantly changing, shaped by the dominant discourses of the time.
Exactly. What might have been seen as perfectly acceptable in one era can become, a source of fear and stigma in another.
And it's not just about labeling, is it? It seems like there was also this push to control those perceived deviations. The book points out that the social purity movement, which is often seen as purely repressive, actually had a feminist strand.
That's a great example of how even movements with seemingly straightforward goals can have complexities. While some social purity advocates focused on policing women's behavior, others were genuinely concerned with protecting women from male exploitation.
So it wasn't just about controlling women's sexuality, but about trying to rein in men's behavior as well.
Exactly. They sought to control male sexuality, not just female sexuality.
It's interesting how those motives can get mixed up, how a movement can have both progressive and repressive elements at the same time.
It's a reminder that history is messy and complicated, and that even those who are trying to do good can sometimes perpetuate harmful ideas.
We've covered a lot of ground already, from ancient Greece to the Victorian era. It's incredible how much our understanding of sexuality has shifted over time.
It really is. It's a fascinating journey full of twists and turns.
Let's move on to the final section of this part of our deep dive. It takes us into the world of imagining perversion.
Oh, this is where things get really interesting.
It explores how in the late 19th century, medicine became increasingly interested in classifying and defining sexual deviance.
This is the rise of sexology as a scientific field, and with it, this urge to categorize and label all sorts of behaviors.
Sure, but this is where we see those elaborate categories for all sorts of perversions emerging.
Exactly. Figures like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis were incredibly influential in shaping our modern understanding of sexual pathologies. They created these complex taxonomies for different types of deviant behavior.
Or fetishism to homosexuality.
Right. They were trying to bring order to what they saw as this chaotic realm of sexual desire.
It sounds like a very judgmental and pathologizing way to approach sexuality.
It definitely was. They were coming at it from this very medicalized perspective, trying to identify what was wrong with people rather than just understand the diversity of human experience.
But the book also mentions that that some of these sexologists advocated for greater tolerance.
Yeah, it's a really interesting paradox. While they were busy creating categories for sexual deviance, some of them also recognized the diversity of human sexual expression.
It's like they were caught between these two impulses, the desire to control and the recognition that human sexuality is much more complex than any category can contain.
Exactly. They were both trying to define the norm and challenging those very definitions at the same time.
What stands out to you as particularly significant in this exploration of imagining perversion?
I think the emergence of the concept of the sex psychopath in the 20th century is particularly important.
Oh yes, that's a term that's had a lasting impact, hasn't it?
It has. It reflects this growing anxiety about sexuality,
Yeah.
especially when it came to children and the potential for abuse.
So it's not just about trying to understand sexuality, but about controlling it, about protecting society from those deemed dangerous.
Exactly. This concept of the sex psychopath really paved the way for new forms of surveillance and control, which are still in place today.
It's like every era has its own set of anxieties about sexuality, and those anxieties often lead to attempts to categorize, control, and even punish.
It's a cycle that we see play out time and time again.
Well, that brings us to the end of the first part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground from the ancient world to the emergence of sexology and the sex psychopath.
What a journey. It's incredible to see how much our understanding of these concepts has changed over time.
And how much it continues to evolve.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process of discovery and reinterpretation.
Stay tuned for the next part, where we'll explore how the understanding of sexuality continued to evolve in the 20th century. It's going to be fascinating to see how those earlier ideas and anxieties shape the way we think about sex today.
I can't wait. So as we move into the 20th century, there's a noticeable shift in sex research.
Oh, really? What kind of shift?
It moves away from that almost exclusive focus on perversion and towards a greater interest in understanding what was considered normal sexual behavior.
So instead of just trying to define and categorize what they saw as deviant, researchers finally started getting curious about what was happening in the bedrooms of everyday people.
Exactly.
It's about time.
And this shift was driven by new research methods,
Like what?
especially those large-scale surveys
Okay.
that aim to gather data on the sexual habits and attitudes of the general population.
So instead of relying on just, clinical cases or anecdotal evidence, researchers were trying to get a broader picture of what people were actually doing
Yes.
and thinking about sex.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a much more empirical approach.
So you can't talk about those kinds of surveys without mentioning Alfred Kinsey,
Of course.
whose work in the mid-20th century was both groundbreaking and incredibly controversial.
Yeah, his research really shook things up.
What made his findings so shocking at the time?
Well, Kinsey's surveys, they really lifted the veil on what was happening behind closed doors.
So he was asking people about their actual sexual experiences.
Exactly. And his findings revealed this incredibly wide range of sexual behaviors and experiences
Okay.
that challenged those prevailing social norms of the time.
Like what kind of behaviors? Give me some examples.
Well, he showed that things like premarital sex, homosexuality, extramarital affairs,
Okay.
they were far more common than most people imagine.
It sounds like he threw a real wrench into the works.
He did.
What kind of impact did Kinsey's research have on society?
Well, his work had a massive impact,
I bet.
both within the scientific community
Okay.
and on broader cultural attitudes towards sexuality.
So it wasn't just about the data itself,
Right.
but about how that data changed the conversation.
Exactly. It helped to destigmatize certain behaviors and open up a more honest and frank conversation about sex.
I can see how that would be really important, especially in a time when sex was still such a taboo subject.
It was.
It's fascinating how one person's research can have such a ripple effect.
It really is.
But even Kinsey wasn't immune to criticism.
No one is.
The book mentions that feminist sexologists in the 1970s
Right.
challenged some of his conclusions.
Oh, yeah. There were definitely some valid critiques of his work.
What were their main critiques?
Well, feminist researchers like Scherheit,
Okay.
they argue that Kinsey's work, while groundbreaking, still reflected a male-centered view of sexuality.
Interesting. So they were saying that even though he was trying to be objective, his research was still influenced by his own perspective as a man.
Exactly. They criticized his focus on orgasm as the primary measure of sexual satisfaction, and they really pushed for a more nuanced understanding of female desire and pleasure. That took into account the full range of women's experiences.
So they were advocating for a model that acknowledged the complexities of female sexuality.
Yes.
And moved beyond a purely biological or performance-based framework.
Exactly. They wanted to understand women's experiences on their own terms rather than through a male lens.
It sounds like they were really pushing the field forward, making it more inclusive and more responsive to women's needs and experiences.
Absolutely.
So we've seen how sex research in the 20th century kind of transitioned from a focus on perversion to trying to understand normal behavior
Yeah.
with Kinsey shaking things up
Yeah.
and feminist researchers adding their crucial
It was a
perspectives.
time of real change and progress in the field.
But what was happening outside of the research labs, the book then takes us to the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s,
Oh, yeah.
a period of such massive social and cultural upheaval.
It was a time of incredible transformation.
Yeah. The sexual revolution, it's often portrayed as this era of free love and a loosening of social constraints.
Yeah, it was a time when people were really challenging those traditional norms and values.
So what were some of the key factors that led to this revolution?
Well, it was a confluence of different forces.
Okay.
The rise of youth counterculture, the feminist movement, and the increasing visibility of gay and lesbian activism.
So it wasn't just one thing, but a combination of different social and political movements all coming together.
Exactly. All of these contributed to this shift towards a more open and accepting attitude towards sexuality.
It sounds like a really exciting time to be alive.
It was. There's this sense of possibility, like anything could change.
The book mentions the fight for gay and lesbian rights as a particularly significant development during that time.
Oh, absolutely. This was a period when gay and lesbian individuals started demanding recognition and equality. They fought for legal protections,
Right.
challenged discriminatory laws,
Okay.
and really celebrated their sexuality with pride.
It must have been really powerful to see people finally standing up and demanding to be recognized and respected for who they were.
It was. It was a real turning point in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
And it's amazing to think about how much progress has been made in terms of LGBTQ plus rights since then.
It's truly remarkable.
But the book also emphasizes the role of the feminist movement in the sexual revolution.
The feminist movement was absolutely essential.
What were some of their key contributions?
Well, feminists during this period, they were really fighting for women's control over their own bodies and their own sexuality. They demanded access to contraception and abortion,
Right.
challenged that double standard that we were talking about earlier.
The one where men's sexuality was celebrated while women's was controlled and policed.
Exactly, and they pushed for greater equality in relationships.
So the sexual revolution wasn't just about free love.
No, it was about much more than that.
It was about social justice, equality, and the right to self-determination for all people.
Exactly. It was about challenging those oppressive systems and trying to create a more just and equitable world for all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
Sounds like it was a really transformative time, full of both challenges and opportunities.
It definitely was a time of great hope and possibility, but also a lot of struggle and conflict.
So we've now traveled through centuries of changing perceptions of sex and sexuality, from ancient Greece all the way to the sexual revolution of the 20th century.
What a journey.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has.
As we start to wrap things up, what are some of the most important takeaways from all of this?
I think one of the most crucial things to remember is that sexuality is not fixed or static.
Yeah. Right. It's not like it's this unchanging essence that's the same for everyone.
It's constantly evolving and changing, shaped by social, cultural, and political forces.
That's such an important point. I think we often take our current understanding of sexuality for granted.
We do.
But it's crucial to recognize that these categories and concepts aren't universal or timeless.
Right.
They're products of their historical context.
Exactly. What might have been considered normal or deviant in one era could be completely different in another.
It makes you wonder what future generations will think of our current ideas about sexuality.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll have plenty to say about our hang-ups and assumptions.
Another key takeaway is that power dynamics are woven into the fabric of our understanding of sexuality.
Absolutely.
Throughout history, dominant groups have used their power to try to control and regulate sexuality,
It's about who gets to define what's normal and who gets punished for being different.
often marginalizing those who didn't conform to prevailing norms.
Exactly. And those norms are always shifting, which means that the definition of who is acceptable and who is deviant
Yeah.
also changes over time.
It's something we see play out again and again throughout history.
It is.
Whether it's the fear of the virago in ancient Rome, the pathologizing of female friendships in the 19th century, or the criminalization of homosexuality.
And those are just a few examples.
There are so many others.
Right. And it shows you how much power is involved in shaping our understanding of sexuality, who benefits from those norms, and who gets harmed.
And it's a reminder that the fight for sexual freedom and justice is ongoing.
It is. We can't just assume that progress is inevitable. We have to keep fighting for it, challenging those power dynamics, and advocating for a more inclusive and equitable world.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
It has been. It's been amazing to explore all of these different perspectives
Yeah.
and see how our understanding of sexuality has evolved over time.
From ancient Greece to the sexual revolution, we've seen how perceptions of sex and desire have evolved over time.
And how much those perceptions are shaped by social norms, cultural anxieties, and power dynamics.
It's made me think about how those same forces are still shaping our understanding of sexuality today.
Oh, absolutely. The past has never really passed. It's always with us, influencing the way we think and behave in the present.
So even though we've come a long way in terms of understanding and accepting different sexualities, we still have a lot of work to do to create a truly just and an equitable world for all people.
I agree. It's an ongoing process, and we all have a role to play in shaping that future.
Okay, so we've explored this incredible history of changing attitudes and beliefs about sex and sexuality. But where do we go from here? Knowing how much our perceptions have already shifted, it makes you wonder what the future holds for how we understand and experience sex.
It is such an intriguing question. It really is. It's like we're standing at the edge of uncharted territory.
It feels like we're at this crossroads.
We've seen how much things have changed, even in the past century. It really makes you wonder what the next chapter in the history of sexuality will look like.
What are some of the emerging trends or debates that you think might be shaping this future?
Well, one thing that's particularly fascinating is the growing recognition of gender fluidity
Okay.
and the non-binary nature of gender identity.
Yeah, it feels like more and more people are rejecting those traditional categories of male and female.
And this really challenges that traditional binary framework
Yeah.
of male female that has dominated Western thought for so long.
It feels like a lot of those old categories are breaking down, and people are finding new ways to express their identities and experiences.
Exactly. And we're also seeing greater awareness and acceptance of a wider spectrum of sexualities and relationship models.
So it's not just about gender, but about how we define relationships as well.
The concept of monogamy is being questioned, and people are exploring alternative ways of relating to each other.
So are we moving towards a more open and accepting future when it comes to sexuality?
I think there's definitely a movement in that direction.
That's encouraging, but it's not without its challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely not. There are always going to be those who cling to traditional values, resist change.
Yeah, we see that throughout history.
The history of sexuality is full of examples of that push and pull between those who embrace change and those who fear it.
And we also can't ignore the impact of technology, right? The internet and social media, they've already created new spaces for people to connect, explore their identities, find communities.
No, technology is playing a huge role in shaping how we understand and experience sexuality.
And it's only going to become more influential in the future.
Virtual reality, other emerging technologies, they're likely to further blur the lines between our physical and digital experiences of sexuality.
It's exciting and maybe a little bit daunting to think about all the possibilities, isn't it?
Absolutely. But that's the beauty of history.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide us with all the answers, but it does equip us with the tools to ask better questions.
By understanding the past, we can approach the future with greater awareness,
Yeah.
empathy, a willingness to embrace change.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about in this deep dive into the history of sexuality from ancient Greece to the sexual revolution. We've seen how perceptions of sex and desire have evolved over time.
We really have. It's been an incredible journey, full of surprises and insights.
Influenced by social norms, cultural anxieties, and power dynamics.
And I hope it's inspired our listeners to keep questioning those assumptions, keep learning, and keep exploring this fascinating topic.
Absolutely. The history of sexuality is still being written, and each of us has a role to play in shaping that future.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
And for anyone who's interested in digging deeper, we'll be sure to include some resources on our website, including book recommendations and links to further research. So keep exploring, stay curious, and remember that the history of sexuality is as complex and fascinating as human experience itself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.